using because several of these are still fully road registered and still capable of cruising around the countryside. Now I'd like also to introduce my daughter-in-law, Maggie, who's somewhere around, and my son, Will.
Behind us here.
There they are, in the back row. So they'll be helping with everything. They help with all the hard work, because I'm better at supervision and doing things as you might guess. And then they'll help us with the refreshments later on. So I thought what we do is I'll give you a little bit of talk about Wolseley. And these are amazing recorders like, so if people have got questions later on, I can just give you a mic and you can be heard by everyone. So Hornetworks, well, one of the key sorts of Wolsleys that get people excited are these Wolseley Hornet Specials, which there are two here. The one immediately behind you, the sports one, and there's a coupe one over there to the far side. But this collection is not just Hornets, it's really various models between the wars, between 1922 and really 1948. So a little bit of a background story first. Well, we think of Holden as the Australian car, but actually Wolseley was here much earlier. And it was in Melbourne that Wolseley really started. And in a very interesting way, because Fred Wolseley, after whom the car is named, he was the younger brother of one of England's most famous generals. General Wolseley and also General Gordon, were in the South Sudan campaign in 1885. And they were very, very famous. They were household words just as the top generals in the English army. But the younger brother of Sir Garnet Wolseley, the general, was Fred Wolseley. And he came out to Australia to farm sheep. And for a number of years he was working on how to mechanise it. Because as you know, sheep shearing, once it's mechanised, transforms the whole rural industry. And Fred had been working on this stuff and he couldn't quite get it right. So he came to Melbourne. And when he came to Melbourne, he went to one of the most important foundries in the history of Victoria. Mind you, there's plenty of famous ones here in Ballarat, like the Phoenix foundry, but the most famous foundry down in Melbourne at the time was called Langland's Port Phillip Foundry. It's a fantastically important one because it went for 40 or 50 years. They had their own, huge industrial works, more or less in the area of Melbourne near Crown Casino and on the other side of the river, Flinders Street. And in 1854, when our railway began, the railways of Victoria began with the Port Melbourne line, it was going to be opened in September 1854, but it's a bit like the Melbourne Metro. They promised the date and they couldn't deliver. They didn't have a loco because they ordered one from the father of railways, George Stephenson, in England, and it was on the sea, it was on a boat, and it hadn't arrived and the opening day was coming up. So what do you reckon they did? Did they honestly go to the press and say, we can't make the opening date, it's going to be next year? No, they didn't. They went to Langland's Port Phillip Foundry and said, look, build us a new loco in 2 months so that we can have our opening when we promised the public we'd have it. Well, I think they chose a bit more ingenuity than the present powers that be in that regard. So Langland's Port Phillip Foundry built the first loco of the first train in Australia, and they built it under extreme time pressure. So they were a very long-standing, competent company. And Herbert Austin had come to Australia, a young English apprentice, to learn the trade. And he worked at several foundries around Melbourne, but at the time that Fred Wolseley met him, he was working at Langland's Port Phillip Foundry. So, Herbert Austin, who built the first British car, which is the 1895 Wolseley, was trained in engineering in Melbourne. But not only that, he was trained in mechanical drawing in Melbourne. They had mechanical drawing classes in North Melbourne Town Hall. And who won the prize? Herbert Austin. So he was trained in mechanical drawing. Why does that matter? Well, when we go forward to the 1920s, Henry Ford was absolutely covering the world with T-model Fords. And every other country said, what can we do to compete with the T-model Ford? And Herbert Austin, who had become quite significant by then, he thought, well, I'm going to draw a car on my billiard table after dinner that can compete with the Model T Ford. So he went to his billiard table and he drew the Austin 7 on his billiard table and told his factory to make it. He couldn't have done that if he hadn't been trained how to do mechanical drawing in Melbourne. And he was awarded the prize in North Melbourne Town Hall for doing that by Professor Curnow, the Professor of Engineering at Melbourne Uni. So the whole English motor industry actually, in one respect, began in Melbourne with a meeting. And of course, after a while, just to kind of get a bit quicker in time, the company shifted from Australia over to Birmingham, and the cars proved their reliability in the first trial to go from, in England, what they call Land's End to John O'Groats, the full length of England, which they did. Was won by the 1900 Wolseley, designed by Herbert Austin. And 50 years later, in 1950, they got this car out of the museum and repeated the stunt. And they drove this 1900 model from Land's End to John O'Groats again, and it was once again perfectly capable of doing the job. Well, in the next few years, from 1900 up to the First World War, Wolseley was incredibly innovative. And they built everything. They built the first motor torpedo boats that could plane on the surface of the water instead of the hull going through the water. They built engines for airships like the Hindenburg, but not the Hindenburg, the English equivalent, which was called the Mayfly. They built a sled for Captain Scott to go to the Antarctic because the English wanted to beat the Norwegians to the South Pole. Captain Scott and his pals, their plan was to hop in the Wolseley motor sled and drive to the South Pole. The Norwegians had a bunch of huskies and they decided they would go to the South Pole by husky power. Who do you reckon won? Yeah, the dogs won. Unlike football. Oh, no, forget that. They built this amazing motor sledge, and there's an article about it in a recent issue of the Automobile. This has only recently been on the shelves in the newsagents, but it's got a terrific article about the Wolseley motor sled in there. And they've got all sorts of other amazing things. One of the really remarkable ones is their gyro car. You know, we think of a motorbike with 2 wheels, and then you can have a tricycle with 3 wheels. There was a Russian count before the Russian Revolution who came to Wolseley and said, I want a proper full 4-seater car that's only got 2 wheels and is supported by gyroscopes. So Wolseley built him one and it worked, beautiful bodywork. And then they had the Russian Revolution and the count was beheaded. And so Wolseley said, what are we going to do with this thing? So they dug a hole in the yard of the factory in Birmingham and buried the gyro car in the hole. And then 20 years later, in 1938, they were starting a little museum for the Wolseley factory, so, let's dig it up. So they dug it up and cleaned it up and put it in the museum. It was perfectly okay. And then the war broke out, and what are we going to do with this gyro car? It's in the way of all our aircraft production, so we dug a hole and buried it again. Anyway, so these are just amazing things that they built, and of course one of the other ones is, we have these velocity rail cars in the railway now instead of locomotive hauled trains. Well, that's what we call a self-propelled rail car, and they've really replaced locomotive hauled passenger trains. So your Maryborough train is a velocity, and there's no loco, just the thing. Well, this technology was actually pioneered by Wolseley in 1904 for the Delaware and Hudson Railroad. So the first ever self-propelled velocity type unit had a Wolseley motor because there was no company in America make an engine big enough for a train. By about 1920, General Motors had got to the stage where they could. But in 1904, the first train of that kind, and it was a big American one, which I've got a photograph of still here somewhere, I'll just put it away. It was built by Wolseley. So they did all these amazing things. And then during World War I, they switched over to making engines for the fighters, for the RAF to fight against the Luftwaffe. And 2/3 of the planes shot down by the English in World War I were powered by Wolseley V8 overhead cam engines, which they made with a technical cooperation agreement, a license that is with Hispano-Suiza. So they were the Hispano most advanced engineers at the time in petrol engines. So these are beautiful V8 overhead cam engines. And if you're ever down at Science Works in Melbourne, they've got one for me there. By the way, after World War I, there was a lot of disposal of surplus war material. A lot of people in Australia bought these V8 engines for speedboats. So there are a few speedboats on Sydney Harbour and one or two in Hobart, powered by Wolseley V8 engines from World War I. So these were very, very good engines and very much technically advanced. And when we got to the end of World War I, the Wolseley people sat down to think about what their program would be for the resumption of civilian production, and they decided that they'd make a new 10 and a 15 horsepower car with all the technology that they'd learned from Hispano. So this little red car here, that's what we have here. It's the 1922 model, which is Wolseley returning from the war and wanting to incorporate all the latest technological advances into their product. So that's a really advanced little car. It's a single overhead cam engine. It was the first ever popular car in Britain to have a single overhead cam engine, and that's about 50 years ahead of the Cortina with the same thing, about 50 years ahead of any other popular car. No, that's not the right way, but 50 years ahead would become pretty universal to have overhead cam engines. But it's not only overhead cam, it's cross-flow head as well. So it's a very advanced engine. It's got full pressure lubrication to the cylinder head, which was quite rare, certainly in America and so on.
It's 1923, not 1932.
Okay, sorry, I'm stumbling. It's the old brain's going. But anyway, it's got full pressure lubrication. It's got an electric self-starter. It has, we were talking about the Rover 3500, which has Timken roller bearings on all wheels, and this car was equipped with Timken roller bearings on all wheels, which nobody else was in 1923, so it's just really, really advanced. And it set all sorts of records, this model, in Brooklands when it was launched. 54 set 54 records immediately. One of them was a 24-hour record for travelling 1,400 miles in 24 hours. That's like Melbourne to Townsville. And the big brother, the 15 horsepower, did the same test and did 2,000 miles at Brooklands in 24 hours. That's Melbourne to Cairns. There are some seats, by the way, at the front of you. So that's what this car was. We're also coming back to civilian production and building these two models. Now, one of the other things they started doing at that time was outrage. Well, I've mentioned to you that Wolseley built the first British car in 1895, but they also built the first Japanese one, because at the end of World War I, they entered into a technical cooperation agreement with Isuzu to work with Isuzu to teach them how to make cars. And they sent Wolseley engineers over who went to live in Japan and work with Isuzu. So up on the wall there we have the Wolseley truck was the first Japanese truck. They sent 200 of the 10 horsepower car, like the red one, to Japan. And the first car that Isuzu actually produced under Wolseley direction was the big brother of that, the 15 horsepower 1922 model. So Wolseley not only built the first British car, they also built the first Japanese car. That's quite an unsuspecting story, isn't it? Who would have thought? And another link they had was to Italy. So they formed a company called Wolseley Società Anonima Wolseley Italiana. And they also made bikes. They made the Wolseley cars and made the bikes. And these bikes were very, very good. They had a lot of teams which lasted right into the 1930s under Mussolini. And these are two posters that were done under the fascist regime in Italy under Mussolini, with the very characteristic art that the fascists had in Italy and in Germany, like those two posters there. They had a cooperation with Pirelli, and they won the Giro d'Italia in 1928 and 1932 and got a lot of stage wins in the Tour de France, if anyone's watching that at the moment. And so that's a pretty interesting thing. And I was standing here telling this story to one of the Ballarat clubs, who's sitting here like you, and the guy in the back row said, "Hey, would you like a Wolseley bike for the display?" And I said, "Sure thing." And there it is, that's his Wolseley bike. Who would have put you? There's a Wolseley bike sitting in the back streets in Ballarat. One of the other angles about the Italian connection for Wolseley is Italy used to be divided into lots of little tiny kingdoms, you know, and when they put Italy together as a single country, the Queen of Italy was Queen Margherita, and the King was King Umberto. And King Umberto was assassinated by some anarchists, and Queen Margherita then continued to sort of reign for a number of years. And in the course of her tours, mainly in her Wolseley car, that's the link, she was the most eminent Italian driver in the Wolseley. She decided to go to Naples, and when she went to Naples, she got a bit hungry, as you do when you go to Naples. And if you're hungry in Naples, what do you want to eat? A pizza. So when Queen Margherita went to the pizza shop, what kind of pizza do you think she asked for? Well, that's the story. She said she wanted a pizza made with the colours of the new Italian flag. And of course, that's these colours that you see on the brochure for the Wolseley 1560, green, white and red. And so the Margherita pizza, if you go to a proper pizza shop, it's got basil, which is the green, mozzarella for the white, and tomato for the red. So every time you have the pizza Margherita, you can give thanks to Queen Margherita and her visit to Naples. So that's the Italian connection. So anyway, Wolseley went on, built these Wolseley Hornet specials in the 1930s, continued with the overhead cam technology that developed in every year through the 1930s. MG took the first and most primitive Wolseley engine, which is up the back there, which has a vertical dynamo drive. The camshaft was driven by the central shaft of the dynamo at the front of the engine. But then in 1932, Wolseley improved it. In 1933 again, in 1934 they improved it again. So by 1935, they had an overhead cam engine, individually boarded cross-flow head, very, very advanced. But MG stuck with the original one, and despite that they won any number of races at Le Mans and all other places and set speed records, even with the primitive Wolseley engine, because all the Wolseley engines, all MGs had Wolseley engines. Wolseley was a huge engineering shop, and MG was essentially what we would know as a hot rod shop. Like it's a place where they got the Wolseley engineering and hot rod. So that's our take on it anyway. So now just I'll go through what we've got in the room for you to have a look at. So starting in the corner is Mabel Brooks's Wolseley Hornet, which is my car as a 19-year-old. It's made of fabric. It was built by Ruskin Body Works in West Melbourne, just near the railway yards. As you come into Spencer Street, it's on your left, and Ruskin Body Works is still there. It's been made into offices, but when it was built in 1929, it was is the most advanced bodyworks in Victoria. It had very large hydraulic presses, so it could make big American cars, make the pressings without any trouble. Because there was a big boom in Australian bodyworks as a result of new tariff legislation. Trump would be very proud of us because we brought in new tariffs in 1927 as a result of the big bodyworks built right around Australia. Our Wolsleys were built in every capital city in Australia because of this tariff law. So the one in the corner was built by Ruskin Bodyworks. Dame Mabel Brooks was a fantastically important person in Victoria at that time. She was married to the Wimbledon champion of the time, Sir Norman Brooks. She founded the Queen Victoria Hospital, the Lord Smith Hospital for Animals, the Animal Welfare League. She was a great student of Napoleon, and she was such a good student of Napoleon that the French government awarded her the Légion d'Honneur, their highest honour, for the work she'd done on Napoleon. And after she died, she left a very big estate down on the Mornington Peninsula to the public with a lot of her collection. So if you're ever having a big rally with the public, you can go to Mount Martha and see Dame Mabel Brooks' estate, Belgian estate, and the old house and all the memorabilia she collected. And so I bought her Hornet for $15 in 1965. And it was up on the nature strip in a house in Surrey Hills. And it wasn't going, so we went down to the wrecker and got a carby off a Morris Oxford and put that on and drove it home. And I drove that for a number of years, and it's the big project for reconstruction next year, because we've still got everything in motors perfect, and that's going ahead. So that's in the corner. The next one across is of the same year and the same bodyworks. So the next one is a Wolseley Viper coupe. There's only two Wolseley Vipers from 1932 left in the world. This one and there's one in England. But this is the only Viper coupe left in the world. And the reason it survived was that during the war it was converted to steam power. So it was a steam-operated Viper. And we got it off a steam enthusiast who's currently building a state-of-the-art computer-controlled steam car up to modern standards. And he needed a few of the steam apparatus out of this. And once he'd taken all that out, he put that in the trading post or whatever it was, and we picked it up. But big trouble in trying to find a replacement drivetrain for it. Just in front of it is an engine from the next year, 1933, but it's a different design because, as I mentioned, they were modernising the engine every year. So up to now, we're stuck with no drivetrain for that car. In the far corner over there is the big limousine that I bought in London in 1972 and brought out to Australia. It was the top of the range. It's a very big car, 6 feet wide and about 18 feet long. And these were used by the English cabinet during the war, ministers and so on, and Governor General of Australia, the Governor of New South Wales, and most famously General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in the Pacific, used one of these cars for his personal limo. And on the circulating movie that's up behind us, you'll occasionally see General Douglas MacArthur arrive at the airport in his Wolseley limo and get in a plane to go to the New Guinea campaign where the Australian troops were fighting. Of course, he was famous in respect of that campaign because he ordered the importation into New Guinea of his first ever toilet, because he wasn't prepared to go in the bush like all the New Guineans. No one had ever had a toilet in New Guinea before, so he had one imported by the Air Force for his personal use. So that's the big limo. We're working on that at the moment, and have a look at the upholstery in the back seat, which has been done by Mark in Griffiths Trimmers and Borough. I think he's done a beautiful job, and you'll see as well in the back seat the occasional seats, because it's a 7-seater, and I'll be taking those occasional seats into Mark to do next. And another interesting thing about it is the first car heaters in English cars came in with Rolls Canadian, put running in 19 heater's over there on the workbench, and there were two heater units because of the glass partition. The chauffeur had a separate heater and demister at the front with little Bakelite demister units, and there was a separate complete unit at the back that put hot air into the passengers. The Lord Muck in the back seat, Lord and Lady Muck needed to be warmed as well. So have a look at that. It's got a partition that lowers and then turns in like that as it's lowered to provide feed for the secretary that's sitting on the occasional seat taking notes while Lord Muck is sitting back using the whisky from the little whisky cabinet that you'll see there, or perhaps shouting orders through the electric telephone, which is connected up to the chauffeur's ear. So the Lord Muck on the back seat can shout at the chauffeur through the telephone, and the orders come out of the speaker just here. So that's the limo. This one here is one of two Wolseley hearses in the world. Ballarat used to be well served by Wolseley hearses because the funeral director, Evans, down in Main Road, they used to have a funeral fleet in which the morning car was a limo the same as the one at the back, and they had a matching hearse. And in 1969, they decided to update. All their other cars were Rolls Canadians, but they had this Wolseley kit that you could use if you wanted to. And anyway, some guys, they sold these, the two, and we got together and passed around the hat and saved the other limo. So there's one other limo like this in Ballarat. There were probably, by the way, 4 in Australia and 12 in the world left, driven limos like that. So the limo we saved, we didn't have enough glass being poor students to save the hearse, the big hearse, 25 horsepower hearse. So it went to the tip here in Ballarat, unfortunately. But this one is an 18 horsepower hearse, and it's the only one like it. It was built in Queensland, and the standards of construction are not too good. Converted from a car, obviously, and the back axle is not exactly parallel with the front axle. It's built that way. So we're trying to figure out which particular mistake it was that they made. The next one across is a very well-known model of Wolseley, one of my favourite cars, still fully registered, still drive it a lot, and have driven it since I bought it in 1968. A beautiful car. These it's called the Wolseley 1885, and that comes from the very last month of Wolseley production before BMC closed the factory and got rid of the whole thing. All the Wolsleys after that were made under badge engineering by BMC. But this is the last month. These two cars are both from the last month of Wolseley production, which is December 1948. And quite a lot of those last month's production came here to Australia, and we also had very interesting stories attached to them. One of the ones I like is that the model was introduced in 1939, and two journalists decided to see if they could drive one the full length of Africa from the top of Africa down to Cape Town. So the only trouble they had was there's no roads, it's just jungle and desert. So they had no trouble driving across the Sahara in this thing, and they got into the darkest Congo, to the Congo River, and the only way of crossing it, there was one railway bridge, no roads, so they thought they'd drive the 18 across the railway bridge, but it was narrow gauge and not quite wide enough, so the car fell off and dropped into the Congo River. And on that picture there, on that thing there, you see a picture of the car lying on its side in the Congo River with the water up to the top. And you think, oh, that's the end of the expedition. But no. Fortunately, there was a prison camp for natives nearby, all working in chains. So they got a hold of a native he's just told the king that they won the war in 1945, and he's driving through the gates of Buckingham Palace in this Wolseley 14 with the top down, with all the crowd around shouting. But funnily enough, the last picture on that one is, in Burma, they've got a very famous woman in jail called Aung San Suu Kyi. Well, her father was the dictator of Burma in the 1940s, and as the dictator of Burma, he had a Wolseley 18 as his personal limousine, and it's in a museum display in Rangoon. There's a picture of that there as well. So that's these two 18s. The two at the front, as I mentioned, are Hornet Specials, and these ones were very successful. We've written a big coffee table book about it. We had 750 race victories in Australia in these cars, even though only about 40 or 50 of them were reported. So many interesting examples. On the wall is a picture of one of these 1934 Hornets in the Australian Grand Prix, driven by Jim Gullett, who became a great drag racing specialist later on, and was one of the advisors for Remco Bradley when they were on top of things. And so you'll see that, and in the cabinet, you'll see one of the many trophies won by Jim Gullett in his Wolseley Hornet book at every major Australian venue. Maryborough Speedway, Roy, Pakenham Races, Fisherman's Bend in South Australia, round the houses racing in WA and so forth. So that's what you can see as you walk around, and there's various little artefacts on display here and there. So enjoy the visit, and we'll start serving a few pies in a moment. Now, as I said, we've got a remote mic if anyone has anything they'd like to ask or anything before we do that. Any comments or thoughts? Well, let's get into it and have a look around.
So help yourself to party pies and stuff. Just ask people to help themselves to party pies. And there's General MacArthur.
Yeah.
He didn't mention Vauxhall. Yes, yeah, but Austin and Wolseley were pretty close. Well, you let me know when you want it done. All right. And he blown trotter. Right.
I've got a copy of mine.
Okay. You let me know.